Para el festejo de 25 años de Marcha de la Vida en México, preparamos un gran evento en la noche que esperamos que todos los que ya fueron a la marcha estén ahí en la noche. Y para todos ustedes que no han ido a la marcha, espero que todos vengan, les toca la próxima marcha y espero que todos estén ahí. Bueno, yo les quiero presentar al doctor Bernd Wollschlaeger. Él les va a platicar su historia. Yo no tengo nada más que decir y bienvenidos.
Okay, I'm standing on the podium, hopefully I don't fall off. Thank you very much for inviting me. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Put it a little bit further out. Okay. Again, thank you for inviting me. I arrived in Mexico yesterday, Mexico City, and leaving tomorrow. So in this whirlwind of events, I'm going to speak at, well, I spoke already in one place, so I'm going to continue speaking. And the reason I was invited to speak is to help you to understand a different perspective of the past. Not the perspective that you've probably heard many times before. The perspective of survivors of the Holocaust, the perspective of the victimization of Jews. I give you a different perspective because I was not born Jewish. And I'm not the son of a survivor, I'm the son of a perpetrator. I'm the son of a National Socialist. My father was a highly decorated World War II tank commander and convinced Nazi. And I am his son. So why on earth I'm going to speak in a Jewish school about my life? Because my life was shaped by the events of the past. Not because I was born during the time of the Shoah, but I was born 13 years after the end of the Second World War. But the effect of the Second World War and the effect of the Shoah affected me. And I started to talk about my life, not because I wanted to, but because I was asked by my own son. His name is Tal. When he was 14, 15 years old, he asked me a simple question. And you speak and understand Hebrew. He asked me, Abba, mi es Saba Sheli? Father, who is my grandfather? And then it hit me that I omitted something very important that is almost unbelievable. I omitted to tell him who I am. Because what he knew about me was what most of children know about their father, what they witnessed. I'm a Jew, I'm an Israeli, I served in the Israeli army, I'm a doctor, I live now in the United States, active in the Jewish community. So how do you explain your son, who born and raised as a Jew, that his own grandfather, my father, was a Nazi? And how did it come that I, as his son, and his wife, can be different? And so that's my story that I'm trying to explain to you in a wrapped-up version, how it all happened. And of course, everything happens and everything is shaped by the place and the time that you were born in and born at. And I was born in a beautiful town in Germany in 1958 called Bamberg. Not that I give you a quiz where Bamberg is located, but Bamberg is a town that is literally out of the picture book of German tourism brochures. It's a gorgeous city, old architecture, churches all over, a massive cathedral like here in Mexico City, a larger cathedral than you have here in the downtown area. And it's modeled after Rome. It's called the Rome of the North because it is literally a replica of Rome in the north. And with this sense of history that I'm literally living in a museum, in a living, breathing history environment, I grew up with. I understood history, but one thing I sensed very early on is that something is not kosher, so to say. Because certain aspects of the history, the adults, our teachers, our parents, my parents, did not talk about. And it had to do with the recent past. And the history was really much present, so we couldn't escape the effect of the past. We as children knew that the war happened. It was obvious. Germany was divided. Only about 30 miles further east, the Iron Curtain came down, the confrontation between East and West. massive troop concentrations, hundreds of thousands of Allied forces stationed there. In our hometown alone, there were 15,000 American soldiers and family members. And I saw Americans every day, American soldiers and officers. And so I asked myself, when the war people win and people lose, and if foreign soldiers are in the town, that means we didn't win that one. So I understood that. And so I asked my parents about that war, and my parents wouldn't talk about it. There's nothing to talk about it, you don't need to know about it, we moved on. Well, eventually they talked about it because they had to tell me something. And then I heard two stories, one from my father and one from my mother. And my father told me over and over and over again the same story, which I can replay in my memory like a movie, that he was serving as the youngest German tank commander in an elite German army unit, tank unit, under the command of a general called Guderian, who was the father of the German Blitzkrieg, those elite battle warriors that battled on every war front that Germany opened and succeeded because they were pushing forward in rapid speed. So September the 1st, the invasion of 1939, the invasion of Poland, my father's tanks were the first to roll in. And then the following year, the invasion of France, and then the year after, in the summer of 1941, the Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union. And during this operation, my father's tanks pushed the furthest east, and he was awarded the Knight's Cross, one of the highest decoration medals that are awarded to a soldier, to an officer, awarded to him by a man whom he adoringly referred to as his Führer, even then when I was asking him, Adolf Hitler. And he showed me that Knight's Cross, which he proudly was wearing around his neck for Christmas and on other festive occasions. And so I had the image in my mind that my father was a hero. What else should I think about my father? And his old war buddies, his old comrades, his friends came to our house at least once a year to celebrate the good old times, the war. And I listened to them, and I met them, and I met among them. There were several well-known senior officers and Nazis, and I consider them as heroes. Now, on the other hand, my mother told me a completely different story. The war as horror, as catastrophe, because she was an ethnic German. She was born and raised in Czechoslovakia, and as a result of the war, she was evicted with millions of others towards the West, and she lost everything. Her family lost everything that was dear to them, beautiful villa, merchant business, everything gone. So the war is glory, the war is horror. But there was something else about the war that my parents wouldn't talk about, which had to do actually with the place that I was living in, we were living in. We were living in a massive building which is still standing in downtown Bamberg. And we rented an apartment in the first floor from the landlady who lived upstairs in the second floor. This was a peculiar elderly woman. She was living alone in this huge second floor apartment with her maids. And my mother referred to her as the Countess, the noble woman, and I should not speak to her unless spoken to. So in the hallway, right next to the wooden stairway leading to the Countess's apartment, was a huge portrait of a man hanging on the wall, painting, depicting an officer in uniform, similar to the pictures that I saw of my father at home, in uniform with the officer's insignia on the shoulder, the Knight's Cross around his neck, the officer's cap. And he looked, of course, different, so I asked my father who he was. And my father looked at me and said he was a traitor, or in Hebrew, Boged. He was a traitor, and I should not ask him anything ever about him anymore. Until I found out from the lady upstairs that this man was her late husband, Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, the German colonel who was leading the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July 1944, which unfortunately failed. And he and others who led the attempt were executed the same night. And this lady lived upstairs, his widow, and she told me this story about the past from a different perspective. So here I had two pictures. My good father, and my father represented, quote unquote, the goodness that I thought that he is, a good person, and this other man that my father referred to as a traitor, a bad man. And I had to understand what the contrast is. And then came an event in 1972 that changed the entire equation. It changed everything the way Germany looked at the past. Because until then, we didn't talk about the past as we were talking about it now. The Shoah, the Holocaust was not taught in the sense that it was taught as being taught now. What we learned in school until then, until 1972, that the murder of 6 million Jews was kind of an accident of history, was kind of a collateral damage of war. In the war, 60, 70 million people died, among them were 6 million Jews, and bad things happen in war. So the Jews were victims like anybody else. My mother actually told me, we were all victims, so why the Jews? And then 1972 changed the entire equation. The Olympics in Munich. Munich of 1972 was supposedly the event that should demonstrate to the world that Germany is a different country. Because this was not the same Germany that hosted the Olympics the last time in 1936 in Berlin, when Adolf Hitler used it for propaganda purposes. This was the new democratic Germany, led by a democratic elected government, actually led by a chancellor. His name was Willy Brandt, who was the first post-war German chancellor or prime minister who was not affected and tainted by the past. He was actually a victim of the Nazis himself. He had to flee Germany in 1933 and return to 1945 because he was a social democrat. And he rose to power in 1969. And I remember in 1970, December 1970, he was the first post-war German politician, West German politician, who visited the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial. And in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, he sank on his knees, bowed his head in shame, and asked for forgiveness. So this same chancellor, with this tremendous moral standing in the Western world, opened the Olympics to a great fanfare in the summer of 1972. And we watched it on live TV because we were prepped to recognize it as this huge event, and my parents invited friends over. It was a festive environment. We had on TV. There was not the time that everybody had a TV. And so we watched it all together. And all the teams paraded to the stadiums, all carrying their respective flags. And suddenly one team carried in the stadium, walking to the stadium or marching into the stadium, carrying a flag with the stars. Of course, you know that this was the Israeli flag, the Magen David. And in that moment, my parents felt silent, as if a ghost appeared on the screen. The do not ask questions moment. And I was curious why my parents react like that, because I didn't see any difference between that team and any other team. I didn't know anything better. And then 10 days later, the catastrophe happened. The same team that so proudly paraded to the stadium was brutally attacked by a group of Palestinian terrorists. 2 Israelis were murdered on the spot. I think one escaped alive. The others were taken hostage. And the German government desperately tried to negotiate the release of the hostages, but the terrorists refused. And a deal was struck to fly out the terrorists with the hostages by helicopter to a nearby military airport out of the Olympic Village. The airport is called First and Third Row. And there, allegedly, a German military Air Force machine plane would travel with them to an Arab country of their choice. Well, the deal was executed. All the cameras were mounted around the Olympic Village. It all played out on live TV. 2 helicopters took off from the Olympic Village, filled with the hostages and the terrorists, landing behind the closed gates of the military airport, First and Third Row. And then suddenly, all hell broke loose. Firefight lasted for 2 hours. Explosions lit the night sky, and suddenly deafening silence. Nobody knew what happened until the news broke. An American journalist appeared on TV. They're all gone. That's the only sentence that he said. They're all gone. What happened is the German police tried to liberate the hostages, was brutally executed against the advice of the Israeli security forces which were on the ground. And the terrorists murdered the Israelis on the spot. They threw a hand grenade in one helicopter, which exploded. All Israelis perished. The other helicopter, they sprayed with machine gun fire, and everybody died instantly. And the next day, in the newspaper, this picture that changed the direction of my life: 2 helicopters on the tarmac, one burned out with the charred remains of the Israelis inside, the other with the bodies of the Israelis slumped over the seats. And a huge headline: Jews killed in Germany again. Now, 14 years old, I understood and read German, of course, but I didn't understand what that means. And I asked my father, what does it mean? And my father looked at me and said, it means nothing. Not again with them. In our house, we don't talk about them. Look what they, the Jews, do to us again. Like during the Third Reich. That's what they do to us. That's what they did to us, and now they're doing it again. So the victims as the perpetrators. And I was stunned. Because in school we started to talk about it. We started to talk about it from a different perspective. From a perspective of guilt and shame that we in Germany, again, are on German soil, Jewish blood is being spilled. And our teachers taught us carefully the importance of the Shoah, the Holocaust, in the context of history. Not as an accident of history, not as collateral damage, but the murder of 6 million is a deliberate action executed by the German government in the name of Germany. And I was shocked. I never heard about Auschwitz, never heard about Birkenau, never heard about the final solution, never heard about these infamous names, Eichmann, Mengele, Himmler. And when I came home, I asked my father, in the school we talked about the Holocaust, what did you know about it? Normal question. My father looked at me and said, your teachers are communists, it's all a lie, it never happened. Don't listen to them. Now here I was caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, I believed my father and I feared my father. On the other hand, I trusted my teachers and respected them. And I needed to find out what happened because something is wrong. And I needed to find out not only because of the history, I wanted to find out what did my father do, the war hero. Was he one of those men who did that? Was he one of those bad people? And I started to read ferociously, everything that I could find. And I started to ask my father. And there was a soft spot during the day that I could find out from my father what I needed to find out, because he was an alcoholic. And during this Twilight Zone moment when he was not drunk, he deliberately gave me some information that was sort of truthful. And it came out in phases. Phase one, he told me, look, Bernd, whatever allegedly happened, or something he already admitted happened, we didn't do it. We, meaning the Wehrmacht. It was all the SS, the others did it. That was all a lie. All a lie, because I found out from the lady upstairs who told me the story about her husband that ranking German officers had to know. They knew what happened in the East. They were actually involved in securing territories for the SS to execute Jews and execute the rounding up of Jews, the millions of Jews. So officers knew, my father lied. Later, decades after his death, I found out pictures of him, a picture of him sitting next to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. And I found this denazification protocols that were provided to me by a researcher. And they clearly reflected that my father was one of those that killed civilians. And he admitted to it in the second phase. He admitted to it, yeah, I killed civilians, we killed civilians, but they were all partisans, they were all guerrillas. So we had the right to kill them. The Geneva Convention, the rules of the war, don't apply to them. Which was, of course, a lie, because they were children. And I asked him, I said, how do you explain that 1 million children were rounded up and killed? Gassed, bodies burned, ashes scattered on the killing fields of Auschwitz. He called that war? That was deliberate murder. He didn't answer me. And then the last phase of his answer was one night only, when he told me, Bernd, Auschwitz was a reality, it had to happen, because somebody had to clean up the mess. The strongest race always survives. That's what I've taught you and when teaching you, when we go hunting, I teach you, and you went hunting with me, that you have to kill the weak so the strong can survive. That is the same thing in human life. You have to kill them so that the strong can survive. So he deliberately supported the Holocaust. And this was the last word that I had with him about that topic, because I was not only ashamed, I was disgusted. My own father, the hero, was a murderer. And I turned away and looking for the answer to the question, why the Jews? What makes Jews, and please excuse me when I use the term worthwhile, to be killed? Why did people would target the Jews? What makes them so special and so different that they kill them? And what I did is I approached my teacher, a Jesuit priest, who guided me in the process. He actually advised me to meet young Israelis and young Jews and Arabs. They were invited by the Catholic Church to come to Germany on a regular basis. And he suggested that I participate in a meeting with them, and I did. And from this meeting, I developed friendships to Israelis. I visited Israel a few months later, actually in a very adventurous way, because I had no money. I hitchhiked to Israel. And from there, home in Italy, I took a ferry. And I was hosted by a Jewish family in Haifa, which was a family of Holocaust survivors. And this family, family of a friend of mine, they introduced me to the concept of forgiveness, because they didn't blame me. They knew I was German, but they hosted me in their home. They shared the food with me. They shared their apartment with me. But a father who himself was a Holocaust survivor, the father and the mother, asked me if I knew about the Holocaust, if they would teach it in Germany. And I said, I don't know. And they guided me through the process of understanding the Holocaust by taking me to Yad Vashem. Actually, a father took me to Yad Vashem. And in Yad Vashem, I understood for the first time what the Holocaust really meant. The mass murder of 6 million in the name of hatred. On the other hand, I asked myself, how can these people, these survivors, continue living, continue rebuilding their lives, continue actually starting to initiating to build an old nation anew? Where do they take the strength from? Who are they? What motivates them? Who are those Jews? And out of curiosity, I approached the Jewish community in my hometown in Bernd, a very small community of about 35 Holocaust survivors. And the chair of the Jewish community, his name was Itzhak Rosenberg, he himself a Holocaust survivor, and most of the members of this community were Holocaust survivors, had the numbers tattooed on their forearm. He offered me a deal that in return for teaching me, I would be his Shabbos Goy, which of course, hopefully you know still what a Shabbos Goy is, a non-Jew who serves in a Jewish community the chores that an Orthodox community you cannot do, making food, preparing it to the table, cleaning up after the services, turning on the light, cooking. And I became the Shabbos Goy, and every Friday and Saturday, week by week, month by month, holiday by holiday, I served. And of course, initially I was not well respected because I was a Goy. They called me Goy, never by my first name. And but slowly but surely I grew into this community. I was accepted. I was called by my first name then. And the closer I came to this community of choice, the more I separated myself from my community of origins, from my parents. And it came to a breakup. It came to a bitter breakup because my father found out. And he gave me an opportunity to choose between them or us. And I chose them. And with one of the members of the Jewish community who helped me a lot, his name was Aaron, and who actually provided me with the warmth and the emotional help that I needed during this hard time, separated from my parents. He had no children himself. When he died, I was asked to say Kaddish at his graveside because there were no family members. And I told Itzhak, I cannot do that, I'm not a Jew. He said, you're one of us. And so I said to Kaddish, we buried him, and I approached Itzhak afterwards and I told him, if you consider me as one of you, I want to be one of you. I want to become a Jew. After 5 years being with you, I think I'm ready to be in front of you. And Itzhak said, that's a bad idea. Don't be one. Be a righteous person, be a Ger Tzedek. You don't have to become a Jew. But I wanted to. And he sent me to a rabbi in Frankfurt to talk me out of it. And the rabbi in Frankfurt agreed after back and forth that I would be a student for the next 2 years, but in return I would never ask him about conversion. And which of course I did every time I met him. And after 2 years he finally relented and he referred my case to the rabbinical court. And it's in November 1986, 7 years after completing this painful, emotional, very hard process, I passed in the rabbinical court my biur, my conversion, and became a Jew. And of course, for me, when I was asked by the rabbis who read to me in Hebrew and then in German, my biur, my conversion certificate, and they asked me, what do you want to do? I had one answer ready. I'm going to leave. Where to? To Israel. Which I did. Within 60 days, I was recognized by the Jewish agency, the school, and the Israeli embassy, got a visa stamp into my passport as Oleh Chadash and an immigrant. And in January 1987, I immigrated alone, with no money, just with my rucksack, and in a certificate that I graduated from German medical school. I immigrated to Israel and began the process, the Talik, as we call it, the Klita. And went to kibbutz, learned Hebrew, worked in the banana fields. Then 1 year in a hospital, get my German degree up to Israeli car. From there, I was assigned to a hospital. From there, after I finished the hospital, I was immediately drafted to the Israeli army because I gave up my German citizenship. And as an Israeli, you follow the rules of the draft. And in the army, of course, basic training, officer's course, because I wasn't professional. And then it hit me. It hit me hard when I was assigned to a unit, Israeli uniform officer, responsible for the health of the unit, soldiers, all Sabras, all young Israelis, and I ask myself, if they find out that I am the son of a Nazi, they will kick me out of this club. They will not listen to my orders. I cannot talk about it. That's what I did. I never shared anything with anybody ever again. Until my son asked me a question. Dad, who is my grandfather? And I had to share, and I had to tell him specifically who I am and who he is and who his grandfather was. And as a result, he shared that in school, which was not a good idea. But as a result of his sharing that in school during a family history day that his own grandfather was a Nazi, I was called to school to speak to the principal who thought my son lost his marbles, lost his mind. I shared it with the principal and the rabbi, and they encouraged me to share it with others. And then for the first time, when I talked about it, I noticed what it really means to them and what it really should mean to me, that this weight was lifted off my shoulders, and that I needed to reconnect to my own past, really to reconnect to that where I left from. And so for the first time, 20 years later, I traveled back to Germany. And I'm looking for my parents, the place where I knew I would find them, the cemetery, because they were long gone. And I found their graves, ironically and tellingly, even though it's just their last January, located one row parallel to the wall that separates the Jewish cemetery from the Christian cemetery in Bamberg. And when you look towards that wall, to my parents' grave towards that wall, we see on the other side the Jewish gravestones. And I told my son who accompanied me on this trip, look, there's only one message that I can teach you, one important message that you should reinforce, that history will always cast its shadow. You can never escape history, not your personal history, not your collective history, not the deep history of your people. What you can learn the lessons from history, then apply those lessons into the future and never to repeat the same mistakes again. Because if you do not learn, the shadow will always be casting. And that's what I'm doing when I'm speaking specifically to younger people. We need to learn from history. Not only as facts and to put a check mark, but the content of history. And what it teaches us specifically is that hatred is not a value. That hatred is not something, an abstract force that permeates the universe. Hatred is something that we generate as human beings every single day by using words of stereotypes, prejudice, anger, and these words have an effect. They fall on a fertile ground, and mostly in the mind of others, they sprout into deeds. And if these deeds left unsheltered, because nobody dares to say or do anything, they form habits. And if these habits persist and prevail, they eventually form characters. And these characters then shape the social norms. And that means that, and that explains why a society looks away when bad things happen, because it's normal. Germans knew what happened. Everybody knew what happened, even though they said they didn't know, they didn't see. Because it was normal to look away. And that happened, unfortunately, throughout history. It's not only typically German, it's typically human. Happened in Rwanda 20 years ago when 800,000 Tutsis were murdered by Hutus who slaughtered them within a 6-month span with machetes. Or 20 years ago in Yugoslavia when Serbs herded Muslims into concentration camps or herded them into ravines and shot them down like a Babi Yar. That happens. Because hatred prevails, and hatred prevails nowadays. If you look at the Middle East, the fight between Sunni and Shia, if you look into Africa, the fight between ethnic groups in the Congo, it happens. And how can we as human beings stop it? We have two things that we can do. We can look away and say, well, this is history, it will happen all the time. So kind of fatalistic attitude. Or we can stand up and stand out and speak up. Every time hatred is being uttered, words of hatred are being uttered, have the courage to stand up and say, this is wrong. Regardless who that is who said it, a friend of mine, somebody from the same ethnic group or religious group, it's wrong. That's the only way we can fight back, out of pride, to become like you learn here, not victims, but leaders. And leaders lead by speaking up. Victims get defensive and retreat. You're not victims. You're a young Jewish generation of leaders who can show your community, the community around you, the world, that you have values that can be applied in the world that are definitely against hate and prejudice. And the last lesson, what you can learn, that anybody and everybody can change. Like me, I became a Jew. It doesn't mean that you have to become a Jew in order to demonstrate that you can be everywhere. So thank you very much, and if there are questions, of course, I'm able to There's no question too embarrassing or too stupid. Every question counts.
Anímense, ayer los adultos no preguntaron, no, no, puedes dar en inglés, ¿no?
How did your relationship with your mother end up, like after you grew up?
That's a good question. How did my relationship with my father end? My father disowned me. He kicked me out of the house. He considered me a traitor. And 6 months after I left, he died from cancer. The only notification I got that I should not come back for his funeral. I should not visit his gravesite, and that I should be ashamed to be his son. That was the end of our relationship. We never were able to reconnect. I was able to reconnect with him spiritually. I forgave him for what he did to me. I cannot forgive him for what he did to others. But in a sense, what he didn't accomplish during his life, I'm trying to do after his death. But I deeply regret that I lost a father, because you only have one.
When you got married, what did your wife think about your past?
That's a good question. Only a woman can ask a very sensitive question. Well, it was a problem, because I didn't tell my wife at that time who I am. I told her that I'm from Germany, I was born and raised there, that I'm Jewish, that I made Aliyah, that I have a funny name, but I'm still Jewish and Israeli. I told her the white lie. And when she found out the truth through my son, she was very disappointed. Not because I betrayed her, but I lied. And when you lie in a very close relationship between husband and wife, you betray this relationship. You take away the foundation of trust. And eventually, with other things that happened, we separated and divorced. Nowadays, we are good friends and we celebrate holidays together with our children. But it didn't work out. So the message that I send to anybody, don't lie to the ones that are close to you. It's not worth it, even if you have reasons to. So thank you for the question. Very smart.
How old were you when you knew that your father was a murderer, and what came through your mind?
How old I was when I found out that my father was a murderer? I found out the truth in bits and pieces. I knew that my father's unit was involved in human shield operations and killing civilians. I found that out when I was, by his own admission, 16, 17. But the real truth about my father's, what he really did, I just found out in January of this year. When I was lecturing in Germany, in my hometown in Bamberg, for the first time in 28 years, I was invited by the city to speak to different groups, mostly non-Jewish groups. And a military historian who was present during one of the presentations that I gave handed to me a suitcase, a small metal suitcase which I have at home, filled with mementos, he said, that I should have because they were given to him by my father's late tank mechanic who died years before. And when I opened the suitcase in his presence, in my hotel room, there were inside ripped up pieces of Torah scrolls. And when I asked him what that represents, I knew that these are Torah scrolls. He said, when your father's unit, tank unit, attacked in the east, they killed everybody. They destroyed Jewish villages. And when they entered the synagogue, they tore out the Torah scrolls, ripped them into pieces and soaked them into water. And then this parchment, this soaked parchment, was an ideal insulation material for tank engines, German tank engines, because it didn't have supplies. So they desecrated the Torah scrolls for this profane reason. And the remnants of this profane, horrific act were given to me as a memento, so to say. I was going to donate it to Holocaust Museum. And so I actually just found out at the age of 57, now in January of this year, that my father actually was one of those murderers, which was very painful, still very painful. It reassured me that I was not wrong, but it doesn't help me to feel very bad about it. Now, I'm not personally responsible. I'm not going to be defensive about it, because the Talmud teaches us that the sons are not responsible for the sins of the father, but the sons can feel responsible for what the fathers did, in the sense that they feel compelled to change the mistakes, not to undo them, but to do something more positive to help to bring out the truth and to teach others not to, that it never happens again. Good question.
Did your mother ever support you, or was she always on your dad's side?
My mother was always in between. She tried to mediate the conflict between me and my father, because she wanted to keep the family together. She wanted to keep the family unit alive, and it was very hard. And so she was holding on to me, she was holding on to him, but in the end, I removed myself physically because I immigrated to Israel. And when my father died, 6 months later, my mother felt lost. She had nobody else to hold on to. Led to her despair. She, according to my sister, she succumbed to senile dementia. She then got Alzheimer's disease and died. I feel sorry and feel a lot of pain about my mother. And the only time I met her again, it was years later after my father's death. I visited her with my children, with my son actually at that time, the only child that I had, so that at least she could feel that her son was still alive and present. I don't know how much she recognized me, but it was painful. It was very painful.
How different do you think your life would have been if the Munich Olympics didn't happen?
All right, it's a great question. One of those that lawyers call a hypothetical question. These Olympics, the tragedy in Munich, I wish it would have never happened. But it happened. And it affected me deeply, not only because it happened, but because of the reaction that my father displayed. And the contrast between my father's reaction to this event. Now, what would have happened if it would never have happened? Could be that I would have found a way to another direction, to another event, to another realization. But it was one of those watershed moments that shaped my life, which definitely changed me. Not only because it happened, but because how people reacted to it, my father reacted to it.
What was it that motivated you first to look for Judaism as an answer to your questions?
Well, that's a great point. What motivated me? I did not understand where people take the strength from to continue in the light of this horrific catastrophe that they experienced. I mean, other people would have disappeared, maybe, would have given up, would have assimilated, would have said, that's it, enough with this religion. It's only pain and suffering. But only the Jews continue having hope and the spirit to continue because they feel that there is a higher purpose for being the way they are. And I admired the strength. I admired literally the koach, like we say in Hebrew. The strength that they had inside to continue prevailing and persisting and to continue living with a positive image. Not to be the victims, and that's so important, not to be the victims, but to be the change agents in their own lives. And that always fascinated me and continues to fascinate me. And that's the way I look at it.
Did you ever tell your father how you felt about him?
Oh yeah. I told him on one of our last conversations that I consider him a murderer, and that if he wouldn't, his inability to tell the truth is worse than what he did. If he would have told me, and I offered him the opportunity, he would have told me the truth and would have asked for my forgiveness or for forgiveness in general, I would have, not that I would have understood it, but I would have been able to reconcile his pain. But he was stubborn and proud about what he did, including the murder. And that has nothing to do with military accomplishments, because there were others in the German military who didn't do that and refused doing that. But he just followed orders to the end, to the bitter end, not questioning one of them, which others did, my father never. So that was my parting moment with my father.
What was your reaction when you told your son, when your son asked you, and what was your son's reaction when you told him?
Well, his reaction was, "That's a cool story, Dad." What else do you expect from a nice Jewish boy who is confronted with this momentous and monumental story that your father told you? It's cool. That was literally his reaction, and then he probably processed it on a different level and talked about it because he needed to get it out of it. But he was, in a sense, he felt pride that his father was able to do something like that, separating himself from the past and separating himself from his own father. And actually our relationship grew much stronger. We have a very close relationship because of that, because I teach my children to be independent thinkers and to be questioning and to not to rely on values that are not true values. And so we got stronger in our literally in our father-son relationship. It grew. There are no more secrets.
Have you ever talked to other sons or daughters, sons and daughters from Nazis, and I don't know, have a conversation with them, how they felt, how they?
Yeah, I have had the opportunity to speak to a few. I met Bettina Göring, who is the grandniece of Hermann Göring, the Hitler's second in command, the head of the German Luftwaffe, this pompous, I use the term fat guy that you see in pictures, with this martial uniform and this kind of Roman emperor appearance. He was captured he actually surrendered to the American army and wanted to impress the Americans with his demeanor. He wound up in Nuremberg in the trial, was sentenced to death, and committed suicide just before the death sentence was executed. His grandniece, Bettina von Göring, lives in the United States. She feels so deeply ashamed, revolted by the fact that she's related to him, that she decided to undergo sterilization and never to have children again. Because she said, I don't want to create a new monster. I met the grandson of Hermann Hess, one of the commanders of Auschwitz, and he feels extremely conflicted about his grandfather's deeds, to the point that he's trying to undo what he did by reaching out to Holocaust survivors, working with Holocaust survivors, assisting Holocaust survivors. There's a movie called Hitler's Children in which he's featured. There's another movie called The Ghosts of the Third Reich, in which Bettina and I and another Holocaust survivor, son of a Holocaust survivor, trying to reconcile this conflict and create our stories around it. So there are quite a few whose life was shaped by the past. And everybody processed it on a different level. Everybody did something else. But none of them that I met could accept it. None of them could accept it as that's our family history, let's close it, shut the door, have nothing to do with it. None of them had this attitude.
What would you say to someone who denies the Holocaust?
Holocaust deniers. First of all, and I say that with the realization because I did try to talk to them, that you cannot talk to a denier. A denier has a delusional, in the psychiatry we call it delusion, a delusional worldview that you cannot break through. The more you try to argue, the more you make them suspicious that it's maybe true, because you try to talk about it. So the best way to deal with the Holocaust survivors, to isolate them, is not to let them infest others, not to let them promote the material, not to let them talk to others, because you cannot change them. You mean you can talk your way through hours and hours, you will be unable to break this delusion. If, of course, they're trying to influence others, like speaking in front of a group like that, you need to speak up and say, you're a liar, and I don't want you to speak here, because they literally poison people. There is not a shred of truth in what they say. So, aggressively pushing them away from the stage, literally and figuratively, and try not to engage them because there's nothing to gain from them.
Do you have any siblings?
Yes, I do have two sisters. One sister, her name was Krista, she died in 2006, and I was able to reunite with her prior to her death and we reconciled. I mean, literally that we met each other again and shared our life stories. I have a younger sister who's 3 years younger than I am. She lives still in Germany, and we reapproached and slowly developed a relationship again. And she actually attended some of my presentations in Germany, and we have as normal relationship as is possible between brother and sister.
When you traveled, was it hard for you to adapt in a Jewish community, knowing about your past?
Now, the unique thing about Jewish communities are, I mean, in Israel in general, if you're one of them and you participate in the life and you're open and honest, they consider you as one of them. I hardly ever encountered negative reactions. A few of them, yeah, a few Holocaust survivors here and there. They had a hard time to reconcile with me with the fact that I'm a son of a Nazi. But the fact that I changed my life and so dramatically, I think brought them more towards my side than the other. And in Israel, it's the following. If you're crazy, I say that with all due respect, don't misunderstand me, but if you're not big enough crazy enough to migrate to the country, serve in the Israeli army, and even insist that you serve in the Israeli army, then you're one of them. And you will stay one of them. And I must say that I would say 99.9% had a positive response to my now Jewish brothers and sisters. The very few non-takers, I respect them, their opinion. I have to respect it.
How did your sisters react when they knew about your conversion, and if so, did they have the same interest of what your dad had done, and how did they react to that?
Well, they considered that what I was doing as a kind of a cult, that I joined a cult, because I embraced a different lifestyle, a different religion, a different culture. I immigrated to Israel, so they didn't understand it. And it took years and years and years later to make them understood what I really did, what I wanted to do. They didn't deal with my father's past as intensely as I did because they didn't want to rock the boat, as we say in English. I did rock the boat a lot. So, but they knew. They had a suspicion.
After all you've been through, what would you say to your dad if he was here right now?
Well, that's a great question. I would ask him why he was unable to open up to something that is so basic about respect for human life, and how he could have violated his own oath of honor as a soldier and officer to do something what he did. That he should reflect on what he did and repent, in a sense at least, to admit what he did. I think if he would have done that during his lifetime, it would have changed my direction of my life in a certain way. But he didn't. So, hypothetically, he probably would have asked me the question that I stated. If he would have answered, I don't know. I think he was too stubborn.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes.
Tuvimos el honor de escuchar sus palabras, lo que ha sido un testimonio muy diferente a todos los que hemos escuchado. Y bueno, aprovecho nuestra estancia aquí para invitar a todos los que están ahora en primero y segundo de prepa que participen con nosotros en la marcha del 2017. Y gracias al colegio por habernos recibido. Gracias.